sixth sense, like the sixth sense in its bill, that's based on electroreception. So by any standard, this is an animal that will be classified perhaps in the world's top 10 most amazing animals. And yet, surprisingly, it's not been the focus of very much attention in Australia as far as management and its conservation needs goes. That's changing now, but we've still got a long way to go. Now, this is an animal that's only found in Australia and is basically found down the eastern side of mainland and also Tasmania. In South Australia now, it's probably a bit questionable whether it's found on the mainland. There is an introduced population on Kangaroo Island, and there are plans potentially to introduce it back to the Torrens River. Now, it's very much a habitat generalist in freshwater environments. So basically, this is an animal we can find from sea level right up to the top of the Alps, and it can also be found in a very wide range of water bodies, ranging from very big rivers right down to fairly small creeks. Can also be found in a whole range of still water conditions, farm dams, natural pools, billabongs, even big reservoirs sometimes, as long as they're not too deep. It's also an animal that can be found in quite disturbed habitats. There's a bit of a myth that platypus are shy and sensitive and only found a long, long way from people. This is what commonly is thought by the average person, but in fact, they can occur, as you can see in the bottom right there, in a very, very highly modified urban environment. Now, I don't want to suggest that you would find platypus equally in these environments. You'll get many, many more platypus in the big river in the top left, where conditions are reasonably good compared to that urbanised channel. But nevertheless, this is an animal that doesn't just live in remote areas. I often say probably half the human population in Eastern Australia lives within a few kilometres of a platypus. And that really brings with it the responsibilities to do the right thing by them and also avoid doing the wrong thing. Now, in terms of their feeding pattern, they are very much, again, a generalist, as you would probably expect. The majority of their food is made up of basically macroinvertebrates and things, down to about the size of chironomids. So they will take fairly small items. They can, under certain circumstances, take other things. And so they can even take fish occasionally, as you're seeing that picture there, although, of course, they haven't got teeth. And so consequently, they've basically got to, gum them to death, which they can actually do quite effectively. We think they're very good at concentrating on whatever is the dominant prey at any particular time. So when a certain species becomes abundant, then they will switch to feeding on those. So they're pretty good at what they're doing. However, the key thing is this is an animal that needs a very high food input. It's basically burning up energy by swimming around in very cold conditions. So it's really burning up calories at a high rate. It's got to eat a lot. And consequently, it needs about 20 to 40% of its body mass every 24 hours on average if it's going to keep in good condition. Now, that's a lot of food to think of if it's basically made up of macroinvertebrates. And so you can see they're a fairly good indicator of species. Basically, the better quality habitat and the more bugs in the water, the more platypus you're going to get, and vice versa. And when the females are lactating, that food demand goes up even higher because of the high demand to produce high quality milk to feed the babies. And so consequently, the females tend to concentrate themselves in the even better quality habitat. And that's therefore quite an important factor when we're looking at its breeding success. Another aspect of that feeding regime is that they need quite long home ranges. You're not going to find the sort of quantities of food in one place. And so they tend to have to move around. And the males can have quite long territories. Sometimes we've found in radio tracking studies, they move 6-7 kilometres. And again, a management aspect of that is that because they are moving quite long distances, if you've got a problem in one particular spot, that can affect quite a significant percentage of the population. So, for example, if you've got a point source of litter or illegal fishing nets being used in a certain area, it can wipe out quite a significant part of the population as they move backwards and forwards, because territories are sort of flexible, as it were, in this moving up and down. I said that they are, relatively an indicator of species. The more better quality the habitat, the more animals you'll get in one place. And this is a quite important concept to understand, because it means you don't get herds of platypus, basically, that eat themselves out of house and home if you get too many in one place. They're very good at balancing their numbers against the available resources. So what sort of numbers can we expect? Well, in a relatively small and semi-disturbed creek, you'll only expect to get 1 or 2 platypus per kilometre. That's adult animals or resident animals, I probably should say. And so you'll see some of the figures there that have come out of studies, those ones at the top there between 1 and 2. Where you've got better quality habitat, such as the study that was done on the upper Shoalhaven River, you're going to get many, many more per kilometres there. But you're never going to get very large numbers. In some of the smaller catchments, we're probably looking at a total population that's measured in hundreds rather than thousands. So again, in terms of the conservation needs, this is a species that sometimes it hasn't got a lot of leeway to lose animals. In terms of its longevity, they're actually quite long-lived animals for a smallish mammal like this. The record was recently set for a male that we know is at least 24 years old. Sometimes in captivity, there's a female at the moment that's 30 years old. So they can live quite a long time. That's exceptional. Probably the average age is somewhat lower than that in most situations. They'll typically produce, they can lay up to 3 eggs, and normally their litters comprise of 1 or 2 animals successfully raised. Occasionally, perhaps 3 if conditions are really good. They mature quite early on at 2 years of age, so they can potentially have quite a long breeding life. But we think the adult females don't necessarily raise offspring every year, given the conditions. But the point I think I would make is that this isn't a species that has any real reproductive problems in the wild. We've never come across populations where breeding isn't taking place. And in most populations, they actually are producing a surplus of juveniles if conditions are stable. Obviously, if they hit problems like droughts or things like that, breeding stops and so on. But because they tend to produce a surplus number of juveniles, they can often make up that deficit fairly quickly. So they're a very good species at coping with the ups and downs that are thrown at them. They're actually much more resilient, perhaps, than we sometimes recognise. I just want to briefly deal with the reproductive calendar, because this does have implications for some of our management activities. Mating occurs towards the end of winter, early spring. And basically that means in Victoria, New South Wales, we're looking at an August to October breeding period. Probably it's a bit earlier than that in Queensland and a bit later than in December. So in Tasmania. In Tasmania, we've noticed breeding still going on in December. So the mating process starts with the males fight with each other. They're equipped with these spurs on their hind ankles that are actually venomous, and they fight to decide who's the dominant male. They then court the females in their territory. We think they possibly mate with more than one female if the opportunity arises. There's quite an elaborate courting process. The mating then takes place. We think the females then build a new nesting burrow and incubate the eggs. And the eggs hatch about 1 month after mating. So in Victoria, New South Wales, the actual eggs probably hatch in about October. And for the next few months, the females are in a nesting burrow with their babies that start out as these little jelly beans that you'll see on the right there, until in about February, March, they are about half to two-thirds fully grown, and they start to emerge. Now, during that period, the females find it very difficult to move the babies. They're basically stuck there. And that's a period when we recommend very strongly we try to avoid work in riparian areas where you might disturb nesting burrows. The next critical period is really then just after the juveniles have emerged. We have a period where they hang around in the area for a while, but most of them have to disperse off and find new territories. And that mainly occurs, we think, in about May in Victoria, New South Wales. Most of them have to go, they often move long distances trying to find somewhere to go. They often can travel, 50 odd kilometres looking for places. Many of them don't make it, and they often sometimes end up in places which are a bit peculiar. So you can be faced in management situations with the rescue of juveniles. And again, I'll talk about that a bit later. Now, how's the platypus doing? Well, basically the national listing that's given through the IUCN Red List is this species is near threatened. And we think that's the right classification for it. You will sometimes see on some websites that the platypus is endangered. Now, let me make it clear, the platypus is not an endangered species. There is a bit of a beat up in some parts about this. It is, we think, quite rightly classified as a near threat. And what that means is that basically it recognises that platypus numbers have declined. And the reasons for that decline in many places are still continuing. And in a rough estimate, you've got about 30 years to start addressing this sort of issue, addressing the problems. In Victoria, the species is now actually listed as vulnerable on the Fauna Flora Guarantee Act, which is sort of one notch up on near threatened. In South Australia, where I think I said earlier that platypus are not found there very much now, and therefore are endangered, recognising the fact that there's not many of them there. Elsewhere, the species is still regarded as common or of least concern. And that is, again, there is some reason to suggest that we should be reviewing that. The point I would really make, though, is that this is a species where we have to be a little bit careful of being too optimistic or too negative about the whole thing. The platypus is facing many challenges. It has declined in many places, and we therefore shouldn't be complacent. And one of the things I would always say, though, is that we need to look at it very carefully on a catchment by catchment basis. We're often asked, how many platypus are there in Australia? And the University of New South Wales did an estimate a couple of years ago where they came up with a figure between 30,000 and 300,000. Now, of course, that's a huge variation. And I actually say that's not really a helpful way of looking at it, because the reality is that platypus have difficulties of moving from one catchment basin to another. They don't do it easily. And so therefore, we really need to look at platypus on a catchment by catchment basis. And when you do that, you get a better picture. And what you do see in some places is that, particularly in some of our smaller catchments, particularly some of those on the edges of the platypus range, they're the ones that we really start to have some big question marks about the future and need to start planning now. Now, what's the major issues that a platypus facing? If I had to choose one overarching issue, what I would say is this. The problem with platypus is, despite the fact they're such a high-profile species, there is still an incredible widespread lack of awareness of where platypus occur. This myth that the platypus only occurs way off in the bush and way off, in places where people doesn't occur, means that we often overlook their presence. And that is certainly true in the management situations. I come across numerous examples where work is done without the slightest idea that platypus could be in the area. And there's a good example there in the top picture of the left. This was this is an important platypus creek system, and yet a development project went ahead which really basically ignored the needs of platypus completely. Now, you can make development compatible with platypus conservation. There are some basic rules to follow, and make certain that there are necessary protection of the riparian zones, but this often isn't done. Likewise, in the top right there, the local council here wanted to establish an RV servicing point to help tourism. Nothing wrong with that, except they chose to site it right next to one of the key platypus habitat usage areas, with all the sort of disturbance that created at night by having RV vehicles there and so on. And again, without proper buffer zones and proper explanations of what was going on. And at the bottom there, I mean, hopefully that sort of picture there shows the sort of things that go on the past that hopefully don't happen too much now. You'll see a nice toilet block built just a few meters from the creek, and then you can see the way the past was developed with no buffering between it and the creek, and so consequently you've got no platypus can build burrows or feel not threatened by people going up and down the path and so on. So it was just all this lack of awareness that platypus are there. And even in some of the most urbanized areas, as I said earlier, you can't assume that platypus won't be part of the equation. And so I said the default position in management should always be take them into account, even if they're not demonstrated to be there. They could be there and you just haven't found them yet, or they could be there in the future. Now, what are some of the key issues? Now, I broke them up into 4 main areas, and I'll be dealing with them fairly superficially. I'll refer later on about where you can get more technical advice on our website. But obviously, flow management, water management is one of the key things for the platypus. The platypus basically only feeds in the water, and to a platypus, water is everything, really. And once we start to have problems with our water, either in the quantity and to a certain extent quality, then it's going to affect platypus. And certainly we've got to ensure that shallow conditions are avoided. We probably, of all the things that impact on platypus, drought is more significant than, for example, floods and other sort of issues. Because and so you can see that when you do get river systems drying up, obviously it reduces the volume of feeding foraging habitat for platypus. And then obviously the other thing that happens is that platypus have to start to move between isolated pools. And when they do that, they're very much more vulnerable to predators and foxes in particular and so on. So getting flows regimes along our rivers is something which platypus didn't used to be taken into account very much. Beginning to happen now, but I really emphasize there are flow patterns that are of key importance to the platypus. One of them is particularly ensuring that it always thought that the flows during the breeding period that I referred to earlier were the key factor. We now understand it's not just that. For example, one of the periods when we need to have flows is in, surprisingly, this time of the year. The females have now just basically completed the lactation process for feeding the babies in the burrows. They are often in incredibly poor condition at this point in time. They really have their system run down for all that lactational demand. They need very successful foraging now to be in a position to be breeding successfully in the next breeding season. Now is a key period. And it's been shown if you get the right conditions now by having proper flows that encourage good conditions, then you are going to get both more females will actually go into estrus in the next breeding season, and they also potentially have a bigger litter size that instead of just one surviving, they may be able to produce 2 in the next breeding season. So getting that flow pattern is really important. So we've got to get regimes right. The other thing we need to get right for the future in terms of planning our flows is to ensure that we have more refuge habitats during drought periods. Now, this is potentially going to become even more important from a platypus point of view if climate change predictions are correct and we're starting to get more dried up conditions in some areas. The ability for platypus to survive through droughts and other dry periods by having refuge habitats that don't dry up is going to be really important. We need to identify where refuge habitats are. We need to ensure that flow regimes keep those refuge habitats fully functional, and we need to try and improve the quality of those refuge habitats. Again, while we're on the issue of flows, I mean, one of the big limitations on platypus distribution, of course, is the amount of, urban stormwater type problems that I'm certain most of you, well, I'm certain all of you are well aware of, the urban stream syndrome and so on. And so as our urban areas expand, obviously that is putting more pressure on platypus, and we've got to ensure that, basically water sensitive urban design is built into all the sort of things we do. And added on top of the sort of standard things, we actually say, in addition to the whole process of providing proper wetlands in urban areas to flood mitigation and other sorts of factors, done properly, these can actually be potential platypus areas. We have a whole range of guidelines for developing platypus friendly wetlands. We worked with Melbourne Water some years ago on ensuring one of their retarding basins was specifically designed to be platypus friendly, and it worked. Within 2 years of the wetlands being developed, platypus had moved in and was starting to use the area. So you can actually turn this into not just a general positive for platypus, you can design it specifically to be a platypus friendly one. Now, having said that water is the key to platypus, we often forget that this is basically also a land animal. I mean, it actually spends time, as much time on land, or rather underground on land, as it actually does in the water. It lives in burrows, and therefore it's the quality of the riverbanks that can be just as important to a platypus as the actual water. And it's not rocket science. I mean, it's basically what I think you'll all be aware of, the sort of factors that make healthy waterways. And the healthier you make a waterway, the more you're going to get platypus there. So the sort of things we found that are really positive for platypus are basically lots of eucalypts and wattles growing near the water, and especially large trees. I mean, the more large trees you can get close to the water, as you can see in that picture there, they are real positives for platypus, not just because the leaves and woody debris are contributing to the quality of the aquatic habitat. They're also helping provide really good conditions for platypus burrows. Platypus love to put their burrows entrances behind root systems of big eucalypts and things like that, because it provides cover from predators. So the more of those we get done, so protect those, and more replanting. Shrubs as well. I mean, we often think when we're replanting along riparian areas, the trees are the key issue, but they are obviously very important. But from a platypus perspective, plenty of shrubby vegetation along the riverbanks is really important, together with overhanging vegetation. What we found is there's real positives where you've got plenty of grasses and sedges and things like that that are overhanging the water's edge, because again, that's all part of that process that helps provide protection for the burrows. And then in terms of the actual substrates of the water itself, I mean, in the creeks, what we found very strongly is that platypus have a preference for heavily cobbly type substrates, particularly up to about the size of, a fist size sort of cobble seems to be very good. Plenty of organic material in the channels is a real positive: leaves, branches, logs, etc. And what about depth? I mean, this is really quite important, particularly when we start to consider the drought refuge aspects and so on. What's known is that platypus can use water up to about 5-6 meters deep. That's why in big reservoirs, they can be found in big reservoirs, but there are limitations on their usage of the big reservoirs. But ideally, you're looking from 1 to 3 meters sort of deep. They will use shallower, they will use deep occasionally, but most of their feeding, we're trying to get habitats that are of that sort of depth. And that's why, what I said, in a lot of wetland areas that you're developing in terms of urban developments, they can often be really, really good shallow, right depths of platypus and Australian water. What are negatives? Well, I guess it's again, it's not rocket science to turn that up on its head. Where we know platypus are really having difficulties is where we face extreme cases of vegetation being removed. Obviously, that's degrading the habitat in various ways, but again, really reducing platypus opportunities for burrowing and so on. And again, all that sediment that builds up in the creek bed is not going to be good for bugs, and less bugs, less platypus. And so again, it's just not rocket science. So what are some of the things we can positively do? If I had to choose one management action would make a huge difference to platypus, it probably would be to start addressing this issue of livestock access to riverbanks. And this used to be a real sort of, it was always thought a bridge too far in terms of environmental politics. But if you see the sort of damage that stock access causes to riverbanks, it's both a negative from a platypus burrowing point of view. If you look at that top left picture there, I mean, a platypus with any brains is not going to look at that as an area to put its burrows. But obviously, at the same time, all that sediment that's going into the water from the banks being crumbled down is not going to be good. Plus, of course, the actual direct pollution that the cattle are producing is not going to be good from a platypus perspective. And in areas where we've done studies where there's, where there's cattle and other stock access, it really is just noticeable that the platypus numbers are low compared to the adjoining areas where there might be no cattle access. Now, it's just unbelievable to me in this day and age that we're still allowing this sort of thing to go on when there is clearly demonstrated studies that demonstrate that off-stream watering of stock is actually more productive anyway. Now, I said it used to be thought this couldn't be tackled, but I think the cattle industry or the livestock industry in Australia is now at the point where it is on the defensive about its environmental record, and I think it's something that politically groups like RBMS and other lobby groups or other groups could get together to start a lobby on this issue. But I think it is one that could be won over the next 20 years, which will make a huge difference to platypus and other aquatic species of various sorts. At the same time, I think now we all recognise the value of keeping woody debris in the water. I think that that battle has been won in terms of, I don't think too much woody debris has been taken out for flood control reasons and so on now compared to what it used to be. But as I said earlier, the other big issue is recognising in our areas, trying to identify where the reliable drought refuges are going to be for the future, and also then start to protect them in various ways by improving the habitat around them and looking at some of the human management issues, given that some of these drought refuges will often be recreational type areas, lakes and so on, that are used for fishing and boating and so on, how we go about managing those better for wildlife, platypus in particular. I'd like then quickly to move on to the issues of in-stream structures, some of the engineering matters that relate to river management, because these can have direct impacts on platypus. As you can see in that picture there, if platypus can get killed by some of these structures if they're not designed to have some escape features built in for platypus. But of course, the big issue is whether things like dams and other weir barriers and so on are causing big problems for platypus in terms of fragmentation of platypus populations. Now, certain studies have been done that suggest that, oh yes, big dams will fragment populations. And remember what I said earlier, platypus populations aren't necessarily big in terms of absolute numbers. So if you start chopping them up by having big structures in them like dams that restrict movement, you then start to subdivide populations and make them less viable. Now, that's an important issue to take into account. Having said all that, I would like to make it clear that perhaps platypus are somewhat better at negotiating barriers than we sometimes think. They do climb remarkably well for an animal with its sort of structure, and they can negotiate barriers perhaps a bit more effectively than we sometimes think. So, for example, that waterfall you can see there, that's the Mackenzie Falls in the Grampians in Western Victoria. There are records of platypus that have traversed that both ways, both up it and down it. We don't know exactly how. We expect they sort of scramble around the edges of that waterfall. You can see on the sort of left of the picture there's a sort of path, and they can actually probably scramble up that. We do know that they can get around quite high weir walls as well. That one on the left, bottom left there is a 6 metre high wall that we know from studies that, you know, the platypus in that area, a lot of them go, you know, must traverse it quite frequently. And there's on record is on camera is platypus going around a weir wall that's 10 metres high at Genolan in New South Wales. Now, you know, so barriers don't absolutely have to be necessarily stop platypus movement. However, there is a limit. Once you start putting up vertical weir walls, then I think there's probably going to be very, very difficult for platypus to climb up something that's really as steep as that one you can see on the top left picture there. And that would be something that's going to start causing platypus problems. When you look at the one on the bottom right there, again, very difficult for platypus to go up the main structure itself. So what they're probably going to do is climb up on the bank level there, which is something within their capacity. But you can see from that, it makes them very vulnerable to predators because it's a very open sort of area. So from a management point of view, we need to look at ways in which we can help platypus cope with these sort of things if we can't modify the structures themselves. And the bottom right one there is a good example whereby putting in more vegetation, providing cover for them, they would be able to tackle that challenge with less threat of predation. Similarly with fishways, obviously we've solved, you know, a lot of our barrier problems with fish by putting in fish ladders of various descriptions. The informal ones on the left there are probably much better from a platypus perspective. They can tackle those quite easily. The more formal ladder type systems that you've got on the right there, platypus have been recorded using those. They probably perhaps use them less easily, but nevertheless, they are solutions. So platypus we can help platypus in these sort of ways. I would stress that one of the things that often comes up is there's been, you know, a lot of pressure or lobbying in some cases to remove weir structures from river systems sort of as a matter of course, particularly to help fish move. I would just, from a platypus perspective, you know, sometimes oppose some of these proposals simply because some of those weir pools that have been there for a long time now do provide very, very, very productive habitat for platypus. We often find very high numbers of the animals in such structures, and they have been there, as I said, often a long time. So they are, while they're not natural in one sense, they have become naturalized habitats for platypus to use. And so before we, you know, knock down too many of these smallish weirs to try and get our rivers back to natural profiles, I would just say, just think about it from a platypus perspective sometimes, particularly in the context of what I said earlier, that drought refuges may become much more important for the future. Another aspect, again, that some of you may come across in engineering matters is obviously pipes need to be developed for all sorts of reasons. And platypus will quite happily go through pipes because they're used to tunnels and whatever. So pipes per se are not an issue to them. But just bear in mind that there is a diameter problem with pipes. In Tasmania, for example, it's been found where you've got quite narrow pipes, platypus can sometimes enter into them, and then if they find the end blocked for some reason, can't reverse out again. So there have been occasions of platypus being found dead in pipes that are blocked. And what we say is if you do have to consider designing pipes as part of a system, make certain they've got a diameter of at least about 250 mils, because that way platypus can, if necessary, turn around and come back in again. If you do have to exclude platypus from areas, if you're developing pipe systems where you don't want platypus or other animals going through, platypus are amazingly good at getting through smallish gaps, and so therefore make certain that the apertures are round about 30 mil or less. I mentioned earlier that one of the problems of nesting burrows is that they are there's a period when you don't want to be doing work, and so consequently make certain that you schedule work outside the September, February period in Victoria, New South Wales, earlier Queensland, later in Tassie, because that's when, if you disturb burrows, you're going to kill the babies. And minimise the use of equipment 10 to 15 metres from the water's edge if possible. And something that is important, if you do, we have guidelines that are available to people about contingency plans. If you do accidentally disturb a platypus, make certain that your works teams are aware of those guidelines and have things on hand. If they do disturb a platypus and a need to get it to a vet or whatever, there are guidelines to follow. Now, other human impacts, and I'll go through this fairly quickly now. We need to educate people on fishing much more. There are still a lot of platypus that get killed as a result of inappropriate fishing activities. Platypus getting hooked and the lines just getting cut. Platypus get snagged. A lot of discarded fishing line. A lot of fishermen are perfectly responsible, but some aren't. We've got to work on that. And therefore we need to, as management agencies, look at how we encourage people to dispose of fishing line and understand not to disturb platypus. Nets are a big problem in terms of how many platypus used to get killed in nets. The good news is now we've banned enclosed nets in almost all jurisdictions now, apart from Queensland and Northern Territory. It made a huge difference. In Victoria, the ban has been in place nearly 5 years now. The difference between the number of deaths in the old days and the deaths in the 5-year period since the bans is just phenomenal. So we need to work on Queensland. If you're in the Queensland area, the 9th of May is the deadline for submissions on the latest regulations that are suggesting a ban. So we hope you support that. Litter is another big issue. In some waterways in Melbourne, where we did studies, up to 30 to 40% of the platypus had something or other caught around. And not always causing fatalities, but it's something, again, that you would not believe the number of things get around platypus, particularly anything with loops. And this is one of the problems that started to emerge in recent times, elasticated hair ties, which turn up particularly in popular swimming spots. And so, again, if you're in the areas where that sort of recreational swimming occurs, big message to be got out is that we need to avoid litter, but particularly make people aware, don't drop their hair ties. Road mortalities, not so much a big issue on the mainland, but certainly in Tasmania, where platypus are much more terrestrial. Again, we need to make education an issue. Where we have culverts under roads that platypus could use, we avoid things like you can see in this picture here, where the deep-sided channels would have made it very difficult for the platypus to use, and so they're more likely to have gone out and across the road. And so signage may be important, particularly, I said, in Tasmania, much more than I would say it's important that all agencies and groups look at platypus. It's important. They are an indicator species, so they're useful species to keep tabs on. If you're doing work along waterways, is there a response in the number of platypus? They are a cultural environmental flagship, so you can get involved with conservation by getting them involved in supporting platypus means that they help in many other species. Some areas you've got populations that do need specific conservation action. Just by taking platypus into account in your riparian management, I think it helps get best practice. And in some areas, you've got ecotourism potential for platypus. And so I would suggest all organisations should look at community awareness and organisational readiness for it. And I would include amongst that organisations should have systems in place to make certain that platypus sightings and ricale sightings are recorded systematically and get into the official database, which is the Atlas of Living Australia, that works crews and other people working in riparian areas have experience of, have knowledge of how to handle platypus safely. Remember, platypus males are venomous. So while we want people to rescue them if there are difficulties, they need to do it safely. And that's how you, if necessary, that drawing there shows how you pick a male platypus up safely. And you need awareness of what the correct procedures are. Now, I said we've got guidelines for those that we happily can make available to, and make certain that organisations have procedures in place to keep track of dead platypus. Dead platypus are useful to people. There are researchers who need them for doing autopsies to look at disease and other issues affecting platypus. But more importantly, it's a community awareness issue of what's going on. And I won't go into the story now that happened in Albury a few years ago, where they got very, very bad publicity because they didn't keep track of their dead platypus, and all sorts of weird rumours then started about serial killers being on the loose and everything else. If they'd have had a proper process of recording what was going on, it would have been obvious that it was fox predation. Community education, obviously, the more we make people aware that platypus don't just occur way off in the bush far from them, they actually occur in their local waterways, the more we can do. And finally, I've gone through this fairly quickly. Go to our website, look, the platypus management section there has got all those various sections that have covered, that hopefully where I've covered some things, got much more detail, got much more references. There are some downloads available that you can track down in the system that have got contingency plans for capital works and so on. A couple of our other sections are still in the process of being upgraded at the moment, but that's all should be there. And hopefully we have got some, we try to keep them accurate so that you've got, we're not dealing with fake news that you can find on some website. So having said all that, I'll stop now, and myself and Melody Serena, my colleague, will join me and we'll answer questions.
Thank you so much for that, Geoff. That was an excellent presentation, and I think we've all learned a lot already. We've had some great questions come through on the Q&A, so I'm going to hand over to Tori now to run through some of those questions with you. Thanks, Tori.
Thanks, Tiana, and thanks, Geoff and Melody. Yeah, we've had some good questions come in. So one of them, I'll just go in order of them being asked. We've got, I think, about 6 questions. Do we have time for that? We'll see how we go. So the first one was, what is the survival rate of the young if there is more than one in the litter? Because I think you were saying at the start, Geoff, that sometimes they have 2 or 3. So
Want me to answer? I guess I'll try that one, since Jeff's been doing all the work so far. As far as we're aware, once a platypus, as far as we can tell, once a platypus female has laid her eggs, she'll then be committed to raising the young to weaning. And we think there are very low losses in between when the babies are hatched and when they wean. The thing is, though, because the platypus is long-lived, I think Geoff probably alluded to that, the majority of the young do die. They probably disperse and then they die before they can actually find vacant home ranges of their own. And so, for example, around Melbourne, we have found that only on average around 15% of juveniles will actually be recaptured as mature adults.
yeah, okay, so pretty low number. They're sort of vulnerable past a certain point, past them leaving their mothers. Yeah, okay. The second question was, the latest IUCN status update for platypus was done in 2014, listed as vulnerable. Do we have a more up-to-date status based on recent knowledge and data collected over the past 10 years?
I'll tell you, it's the whole question of the status of the platypus nationally there has been a great deal of information collected in a great deal of areas, and we are getting more of a handle, but I think that there's still work to be done. I think one of the most salient things that has come out in the intervening period is that there are, as far as people are now happy with it, 4 main areas that are considered to be evolutionary units for platypus. So they consist of Tasmania, then there's New South Wales and Victoria, basically, most of Queensland, and then far north Queensland. And as far as we're aware, each of the main 3 subunits, Tasmania, the southeast, and then the main parts of Queensland, probably comprise enough animals that they are unlikely now to be under major threat. There are still a lot of animals in a lot of waterways. I don't know what the status is of the animals in far north Queensland. They are, there's only a few very small rivers there. And we have, our APC has recommended to the federal government that there be more in-depth studies there to actually ascertain what their status is. Meanwhile, I think that going forward, right now, platypus numbers, they do, based on what we know, what we learned in the Millennium Drought, platypus populations are probably adapted quite well to changing from high to low and back to high again in response to drought. Of course, now we are being faced with longer term climate change, which may mean that we're getting less and less area for the platypus, and it's getting hotter and hotter and things drying out. And I think that there's going to need to be more emphasis in the future and kind of awareness of managing drought refuges. And I believe Geoff, addressed that, but I really think that that is something that needs to be on everyone's radar, not just on behalf of platypus, but aquatic fauna generally, that there has to be, that's going to be really, I think, an important focus for adaptation for, maintaining these animals into the future.
Yep, definitely agree. Then we had 2 questions that are sort of similar about flows. So I might read both of them, and then you can see how you want to answer this. In some rivers, environmental water is delivered in spring periods, October to November, particularly for migratory fish species, which use flow cues for downstream migration. In regards to considering nesting females, does river height at time of mating influence the location of the burrows? And what advice would you give for avoiding flooding nests at critical time periods?
Can I answer that one?
That was one. Yeah, go
because
for
I
it.
might lose track if we have a second.
Yeah, they're big questions.
Very, very quickly. The first answer is that we don't have any really good hard evidence about how females select their nesting burrows or the criteria they use. But we do know that they do tend to be higher up in the bank profile than your normal everyday camping burrows. And that is assumed to be partly that the females are trying to avoid their nests becoming inundated by rapid changes in flow. The other thing is that intuitively, and this is we're just projecting, but it kind of makes sense to me that the animals would use the information that's available to them around the time that they're selecting nests. So in New South Wales and Victoria, that would especially be in the period, say, August, September, and possibly into October, although it'd be basically August, September, that they are likely to go around and they'll either dig themselves a new burrow, or more likely they will refurbish an old burrow, because there are a lot of burrows out there. And I would have thought that what they will do, if there has been at least one high flow in the near to that time, they'll go into a burrow, and if it's been inundated, they'll go in and they'll go, this is way too wet, I don't want to have a nesting burrow in here, and then they'll look for one higher in the profile. So it makes intuitive sense that if you know or anticipate that you're going to have high managed flows when the juveniles are present in December and January, particularly, that you might want to have an antecedent flow of the same magnitude or possibly more early in the spring or late in the winter to help cue the females to look for something even higher up in the profile.
Okay, that's really good. Thank you. So the second question that was similar to that, which I think you've somewhat answered. Yeah, this person said, I've heard the females use winter high flows as an indicator for where to set their burrows above the high water mark. Problems can arise if spring flows peak higher than this, e.g. bank full flows, and flood the burrows. So a good idea for water managers is to have spring flows no higher than peak winter flows. And they've said, is there any truth to this?
Yeah, so that's basically it. Just to say, did you mention about pugging of burrows at all? There was when a female platypus, when she has very small juveniles in burrows, she does actually plug the burrow with compacted soil plugs, 2 to 9 plugs along the entryway. Every time she goes in, and then every time she comes out again, she burrows through these and then puts them back together with her tail, so that there's a whole string of little barriers between the entrance and where the babies are. That is, and it's thought that is probably to help to avoid predators, but also to try to keep out flows if it only goes up in peaks really in a very, very short period of time, as is typical in natural storm events. But once the babies get to be a certain age, that obviously is very, very energetically, expensive from her point of view. So as they get older, the females stop doing that. And it's probably around, the babies are coming out into January, beginning of February here in Victoria. The females probably stop pugging around 4 weeks before that time. And so actually the most vulnerable period is going to be actually in the latter half of when the juveniles are present in burrows and before they've emerged. So it's around here in Victoria or New South Wales. It would basically be, you really have to worry about the flows in December and January more than at any other time of the year.
Okay, great, thanks. I'm just conscious we're at 1 o'clock now, so I can ask some more questions if you two have time for it. We've got another 3 maybe.
I can try to do it really quickly. I mean, we have time.
They seem a bit simpler, yeah.
Yeah.
One is, do you know if platypus have a water temperature thermal tolerance?
That's easy to answer. It's around 28 degrees C. So that's based on captive observations where the animals become, quote, noticeably lethargic once it goes above about 28 because they're getting too hot and they don't want to exert themselves. It's probably, once it gets up to an animal was historically, people they took this poor animal and they exposed it to 35 degrees and it was too much for it. So, I mean, they're definitely they're subject to temperature stress, and 28 seems to be about the limit.
Okay, and is there a lower limit?
Not really. I mean, they're really, really good at staying warm. They have an air layer. Most of their skin actually stays dry in the water. So they have the equivalent of a 5 millimeter neoprene wetsuit on all the time. I mean, they're really, very, very well insulated. So animals can stay active in water where there's literally ice in Tasmania that is forming on the edges, and they can feed in that for 10 to 15 hours happily. I mean, it's just, we would be dead, but they're okay.
Yep, I have seen them in Tassie walking across the snow. I was like, whoa. One other question. Maybe we'll try and get the other questions answered outside of this and get back to participants if that's possible. But maybe just the last one, which seems fairly straightforward. Where do platypus go during flood events?
We have the best information. It depends on how bad the flood event is. If it's an overbank flood, it means the animals no longer have access to their burrows. So they can, and they do, definitely swim. They'll swim out to the perimeter of the flooded area and they'll feed there. So we've had lots of, anecdotal information about animals being seen during floods on golf courses and places like that. They'll be eating dead worms and, all kinds of stuff like that that will become available because of the flooding, but they won't have access to burrows. And we have done radio tracking work many years ago along the Yarra, where there was a flood that just happened when we were doing our flooding. And the animals, what happened is they would shelter under things like large logs and stuff like that, looking really unhappy. But I mean, they all survived, but they really did not have very good shelter sites at all.
Great, thanks, Melody. Tiana, did you just want to jump back in to close the session?
Thanks, Tori, and thanks so much for Melody for answering those questions, and for Geoff for your presentation today. And thank you for everyone who's attended. It's fantastic to see so many people interested in platypus conservation. We hope you got the answers that you needed, but feel free to send us an email at RBMS if you didn't. And I'll also direct you to APC's website once again, where you can find all of the information that's available on there. It's an absolutely brilliant resource, so I encourage you to visit it and make use of it. All right, I think I'll wrap it up there, but we'll pop this video online as soon as we can as well. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, thanks, Tiana.
Thank you so much for organizing it, Tiana and Tori.
Thanks, see ya.
Thanks, bye.